back. Thank you so much for staying with Lookup TV. This is Lookup News. Nancy NELIMA here. And now joining me to talk about the fuel prices surge. Right next to me in my immediate right is RONALD, BWOSI, economist. Karibu. And SITATI, WASILWA, political economist. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And let's talk about fuel prices. It has been the trending topic of the day. And just 2 days after the President, William Ruto, was sworn in, and he had talked lengthily about the subsidies that was going to be taken off from the fuel prices. So let's just talk about what Kenyans are feeling, the pain at the pump.
Yeah, I agree with the NELIMA. Currently, the pain in the pump is quite adverse. People are quite affected, including myself, because you realize that now the prices have hit the roof. You go and actually the fuel prices have almost doubled in the just last couple of years. So it's quite crazy for most of the industries. And indeed, people are looking forward to the new president to put in interventions to lower these fuel prices in order to cushion the common mwananchi. And looking at it is, for people who are employed, still they feel a lot of pain. I'm just feeling for anybody who is looking for a job now, people who are actually not able to predict the future, and those earning very little income also. It's going to be quite difficult because there's a high inflation rate. Today you walk in the supermarket shelves, everything has skyrocketed in terms of price. So we are in a very difficult position, a very precarious condition. We hope that there are going to be very much immediate interventions by the new government in order to cushion this. But looking at hearing the president saying that he quite discourages the issue of subsidies, I'm just looking forward to what kind of interventions will be done, because if you look at the IMF has been protesting the issue of subsidies. Right. Of course, again, looking at the fuel prices, there's another driver of that price, which is KRA taxes. Because if you're not using subsidies, the immediate then strategy is to lower the taxes. But again, IMF is not ready to allow the country to do that, because we are indebted, and IMF is very, very particular in terms of the fiscal policy the government is doing. So it's quite being in between a rock and a hard place. So we look at what is going to be done if there are no subsidies, what is going to be done in order to stabilize fuel prices. Right.
Yeah. And SITATI, you'll just come in and let's talk about how we've seen Kenyans, and even the story that we have done, complaining that the fare has already hiked. So already the situation, even without the rise in the prices of commodities, just the fuel itself, bringing a strain even to the transport sector.
I mean, looking at the situation as it is, then I've had the opportunity to listen to the folks in government saying that, you know, this is just a kind of a short-term thing, or let's suffer in the short term and then have the last laugh in the long term. But I tend to think any other business person, be it in the transport sector or a totally different sector or industry, they'd want to look at the present, you know. If the fuel prices are going to increase in the short term, and then definitely the prices of commodities will be significantly affected. And so it shouldn't just be a matter of looking at whatever is going to happen in the short term, but even in the long term, whatever the government is promising on the new occupants of the presidency are promising to bring in as new measures, then we have to interrogate them keenly. But my colleague has mentioned a very important thing, which also many people are missing in all this kind of conversation. The ideological warfare behind all these you know, notion to do away with the subsidy is because of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, which after advancing a couple of loans during, you know, the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, then one conditionality was to get rid of the fuel subsidies. And this is not a condition that is only peculiar to Kenya. You look at Nigeria, the IMF is singing the same song. You look at Zambia down here, the IMF is still singing the same song. And even beyond Africa, in Pakistan, still the same. In Bolivia, in somewhere in South America, still the same. So we've got to look at it in a more practical sense. But at the end of it all, right, the average citizen is going to bear the full cost of it.
Okay, and we talk about subsidies, BWOSI. What exactly are subsidies? Because it is a term that Kenyans hear, the subsidy is off, so the prices are higher. Yeah. So just take us through that. Yeah,
subsidies is what the government does is that for the fuel players at a certain price, the government is promising that it is going to actually give them some money in order to refund them for a price that is not a market rate. Right. So that they are able not to charge that rate, because the excess price over a certain predetermined price will be refunded to them, so that that price is not passed to this consumer, which is the way the president says it's not the right way to go, but it also depends what kind of commodities. Are we really in perfect control? Because the biggest challenge that we face as a country is that we don't have oil production at Florida. Of course, the exploration into Turkana has not come to, it has not seen the light of the day. Right. And of course, there are things that we don't produce, like fertilizer. We import mostly fertilizer. So we have no control in terms of the prices of those commodities. But the best way actually to forego subsidies, instead of allowing the various distributors and retailers to sell various products to consumers at a very high price, is to lower the taxes, because there is import duty actually incurred in terms of even importation, right, of various commodities. So if you're able to lift import duty, lift VAT, and of course even zero rate most of the commodities, then you are likely to correct the price without necessarily resorting to subsidies. Because subsidies, there is also the waiting period, because you had fuel distributors up in arms and saying that, yeah, the government is promising subsidies, but those subsidies are not coming in time because of the inefficiencies in government releasing money and the bureaucracies and the challenges that come with it. So it is not a very perfect way to do it, because it is under a lot of strict government control, and it's not promising to the players. So that's why players are not happy with it. Yeah, so it's a way the government compensates the suppliers or distributors of commodities by actually refunding them the price that it could be deemed excessive over the best price.
Right.
Yeah.
And the President, William Ruto, did tell Kenyans that the subsidy, the 1 month subsidy in the period towards the election, it cost Kenyans, just a month cost Kenyans about 7 billion, which is a lot of money. But so without the subsidy, so what is then the best way forward, SITATI?
Well, I think that was in the case of, was it the subsidy for maize or something? But even when you look at that for fuel, it's not anyway different. I mean, checking the statistics from January to June this year, I think the government has spent around 71 billion Kenyan shillings in terms of the fuel subsidy. But the alternative to that then would be to lower the taxes. But then how do you lower the taxes when you have a government that is struggling to pay, public debts? I mean, or the huge amounts of public debt, then it becomes a challenge. I think, if I'm not wrong, statistics for June published by the government indicated that at least by then, I cannot really remember the price of fuel per liter by then, petrol to be specific, but the taxes alone amounted to around 62, 63, 4 Kenyan shillings. That's only fuel taxation, which compounded to the final price of the fuel at the pump. So if we are to look, or if the government is to consider then lowering the taxes, what is the alternative, to try and get or broaden the tax base? Is it going to be in the immediate term, or is it going to take a longer term? But another important thing to look at, just before the other parliament I mean, before we went in for the elections, the previous parliament, there was a bill which had been tabled, I think, by one of the, parliamentary committees. We had the parliamentary, I can't remember really the name, but there's a particular bill which was tabled in Parliament, yet to be adopted, which contained or designed a way in which the taxes and the levies on fuel were going to be reduced. So hopefully the incoming Parliament is going to adopt the bill and try to see to it if some of these fuel levies or taxes are going to be reduced. But that's a catch-22 situation for the government because then they have to find alternative means to compensate the amount of fuel raised along, the amount of revenue raised through fuel tax. Yes.
Sure.
And the president, during the inaugural speech, said a very interesting thing, and that the best way to alleviate or to eliminate subsidies is to spur production. And things like maize, the lack of unga in this country is not an accident. I sometimes think it's deliberate because it's very easy. To maize, it takes almost not more than 6 months to grow up, especially depending on the location. And you had, this country, we have massive land that can be put to farming. If there are strategies that are put into place to make sure that this country actually is exporting maize and is not importing unga, that can be achieved in a very short period of time. So, because you look at what's happening, you look at North Rift, you look at Trans Nzoia, you look at Western, you look at even part of Rift Valley, you look at even parts of Central, they are very productive land that if maize is planted in those areas, there will never ever be deficits of unga in this country. Look at what was done at Galana Kulalo, a project that was supposed to really increase productivity of unga in this country. The 7 billion that is given to subsidies of unga, that money should have even been put into production. I don't know why, as a country, we never are not very deliberate about export, but we are very quick to import. But we don't plan for export. So some of those things, that money that could alternatively be used for subsidies, if it could be used in order to incentivize productivity, to encourage farmers that if you plant your maize and for instance, you are not able to sell the maize, then we are able to provide you markets either through, you can export some of those maize either to Sudan, to Somalia, some of the neighboring countries. So I say that is the most perfect, another perfect way to eliminate the issues of subsidies.
Right, and of course, among the things that the president said on the inauguration day was allocating budget to the judiciary, to the police service as well, and to increasing it as well. But again, the debt in Kenya is the budget, it's in itself, is in trillions. And so allocating more money to different sectors, where will this money come from? Will it not just increase our national debt?
Yeah, if you look at the budget for last year, around 60 billion shillings was allocated to agriculture. And of course, a significant cash is into education and then security and all that. So increasing money to judiciary is a welcome move because that will actually help into the issue of administration of justice. Right. And of course, also encouraging other independent offices like the Auditor General and the controller of budgets, that's a welcome move. But then now there must be a balance between the budgetary allocations that are able to spur production against the other budgets that are done for service delivery. Of course, again, I don't know the impact that is going to have to the National Police Service when they say that they're going to be given their autonomy of budget control, because already on security, from the last budget, we have more than 300 billion shillings allocated to security. So if that is going to increase that budget, then we are added to even more crisis in terms of our budgetary allocations and managing, and of course, escalate our debt crisis. Already, we have issues because IMF want to micromanage situations here because we owe them. Because, you know, when you have a borrower who is, you've borrowed money and there is a lender who is on your case, actually manages your decisions internally, then you have your hands are tied. So we wait to see how this government will play out in that. But indeed, that is actually another big challenge that they're going to experience in terms of where do they get the money in order to increase their allocations to the judiciary and, of course, to the other independent offices, which is a welcome move, yes, to encourage transparency. Of course, even the Auditor General and the Controller of Budget, especially if you put in there, probably you're going to fight corruption, reduce expenditures in various governments, and then now allocate it to other most urgent ministries. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, Sitati, the president also did say that it's going to focus more on production. Or do you think that that's now a sustainable strategy?
Well, I mean, some of these things, if not all of them, when you have to look at the history of policy making in this country, you discover from the very first beginning, with the first independence government, we have similar kind of stuff or similar kind of policies, perhaps just gathering some dust somewhere in government offices. And I don't really think it's a new thing. It's only that maybe previous governments have not been really disciplined enough to see to it that, emphasis is put at the production point or at the production level. And even not to go far, because in government you have the principle of continuity, with the Vision 2030, which I'm afraid most of the things are not going to be achieved, but it's emphasized that one of the pillar sectors or one of the industries, or rather sectors which need to be driven up is agriculture, which then becomes a mainstay for enhancing food security and then for facilitating the development or the growth of agro-based industries, and then create all those backward and forward linkages to spur the manufacturing sector and so forth. He's given a very good case, the Galana Kulalu project, which in my case or in my view failed spectacularly, not because of any other thing than but apart from the lack of political willingness and too much corruption in it. So up and until we address corruption, because even to a very large extent, agriculture is still a devolved function if you look at it constitutionally. So even the county governments have a lot of work to do. Of course, not in isolation, but that's it. Together with the national government, they have a lot of work cut out for them, that going forward then a lot of emphasis is put at the production point. If we are able to address the cost of the production point, then apart from these other additional costs like manufacturing and transportation and whatnot, then we are going to cut significantly the costs of some of these basic stuff.
Right. And let's talk about a growing economy. As Kenya is over the different governments. And we saw even President Uhuru Kenyatta in his last address to the public say that the GDP of Kenya has tripled from between 2013 to the time now that he's leaving office in 2022. So what signifies that an economy has actually grown?
Yeah, in terms of the economy's growth is issues to do with production of an economy. So in terms of, when you talk about GDP, mostly is the gross domestic product in terms of how much productivity has been achieved in a certain period of time. And that productivity is dependent in terms of even construction, agriculture, even service contribution into the service industry. Of course, then you have to also less in the export market and all that. So the challenge is that, yes, we have experienced a growth in the GDP over the last couple of years, significant growth in terms of productivity. But you realize that this productivity has not been felt across the sectors, or even by even individual households. In fact, to just say, yeah, we've actually achieved a higher purchasing power. That has been the challenge. And the challenge is because one is how we measure the GDP. And I've said in the past that the best way to try to also look at the GDP is, of course, measure the GDP, and to look at how has the GDP affected individual households in terms of what is their purchasing power. Because there is a risk that if you continually measure and evaluate an economy based on the gross domestic product, you might actually forget about the ordinary Kenyan in terms of their salaries and their purchasing power. Because you might find that there is growth in the high net worth individuals, but the purchasing power of the local mwananchi is quite devastating. And then that leads to a very big challenge in an economy. Yeah, so GDP is okay because it measures various parameters. But then again, you look at it in terms of the road network. For instance, if you're talking about the construction of the express highway, that contributes to the GDP. But does it help uplift the economic being of an individual? Of course. In a short term, very little, it helps. So it can be felt, yes, but it can be seen, can be measured, but cannot be felt because the contribution to individual. So maybe I say that in future, rather than just relying on the GDP, is to measure we need to introduce some parameters of measuring economic growth. One in terms of how many people are accessible to water, the quality of life. Rather than using GDP, measure using quality of life. How many people have access to water? How many people have access to healthcare? How many people have access to education? How many people have access to basic food commodities? And how have we progressively lowered the disparity between the rich and the poor? That even a common mwananchi maybe earning the basic minimum salary can afford basic commodities, can afford food, can afford healthcare, can afford education without a biggest problem. Right. So we need to come up and say that, yes, the hustler, yes. Can we say that now every Kenyan must live the Kenyan dream, whereby they are able to have access to the basic commodities, food, healthcare, water, sanitary and, education, even for their children, with their minimum wage.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Sitati, you'll weigh in on the same, and bearing in mind that the current government of William Ruto is one that was riding on the slogan, the hustler narrative. And so many hustlers who are the majority in Kenya are expecting to feel a change in their day-to-day. And now with the fuel prices that are already surging, then there are comments across social media that maybe we are on our own.
I mean, at the end of the day, all of us, we are on our own because the government largely is there to facilitate or to create an enabling environment. But certainly it cannot escape from the responsibility of lowering the cost of living for members of the public. I mean, it's a security risk for the government itself. So to answer your question, perhaps I can delve slightly to what my colleague was responding to. You know, an average citizen, an average member of the public, an average consumer does not really care so much about the GDP. GDP to them is as good as a hot air, And most governments, when you look at the history of the GDP, formally dating to the late 1920s, early 1930s, when, during the Great Depression, and even through to the Second World War, the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, and so on and so forth, GDP has majorly been a political tool, a political instrument for governments. So to a politician, to a hold of government, a public office, if you're having all these glaring or beautiful GDP figures, that the GDP has grown from this to this, a politician says, now we have pushed the economy forward, the economy has grown. But what the average person wants to see is to have affordable food at the end of the day on his or her table, to have schooling affordable for his or her children, to have access, easy access for that matter, to affordable healthcare. So being on your own as an average citizen simply implies that in some one way or another, that perhaps you're not feeling all these beautiful statistics being dangled by the government in front of your eyes, So at the end of it all, the cost of living has to be made affordable for, especially for the average or the common person, and not just making it affordable, but also ensuring that you have the government creates an enabling environment for the creation of decent jobs, which in most cases, when you look at economic history, then you have to you need to have a very viable, strong manufacturing sector, which unfortunately, when you look at the figures over the last 10 or so years, the contribution of the manufacturing sector to the economy has been a bit stagnant, not really impressive. And so you wonder, how are you going to create all these kind of millions of jobs? Because statistics by the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics only dwell on the creation of millions of informal jobs. Informal jobs are not sustainable. And perhaps that's why we keep on wondering what's going on if the GDP is growing. We're not seeing anything, yeah.
Let's talk about the manifestos. We've seen different manifestos in different regimes, and even the outgoing Jubilee government, which had a very colorful manifesto, a promise of laptops, a promise of stadiums, different things. So when you look at a manifesto and then actualizing it, bringing it to life, so what is the disconnect?
The disconnect is, there's a difference between theory and practice. Because there's so many things that you study in school or have a lot of theory, read about and all that. But in terms of execution, that was where the problem is. And everybody has an idea. The difference, even the most fool has a big idea. The difference between those people who have ideas and those who make it in life is not in terms of the idea, but in terms of how they execute it and how they bring it to reality. And even when the challenges creep in, they remain more resilient and more focused to what they want to achieve. So manifestos are just ideas. They're just ideas and people that give people, and of course, promises that are given. So,
and let's specifically talk about the creation of jobs. What, in your opinion, is the challenge to just creating jobs by a government?
The challenge for creation of jobs, I believe, one is the challenge with regards to, because the best way to create jobs is to encourage industries. It is very easy and tempting to import things. You know, that's easy. We like quick fixes. Like, for instance, maize, go and import. Sugar, we are killing the Mumias Sugar Company. We are killing all the sugar belt industries. Go and import, repackage, and do what? Sell it to the market. Because there are people who have interest in, imports. Like rice, go import rice, package it, moya rice, and do what? Sell, killing the industries locally. So one of the challenges we have is conflict of interest. If the politicians are players in various import business, which is very easy to import, repackage, and sell locally, then they will not be committed to, in terms of encouraging local manufacturing, which is an ultimate way of creation of jobs. So one is conflict of interest, so lack of objectivity in that particular, and then two, lack of commitment. Because most of these politicians, they've given people 1 or 2, 3, 4 money, so they're looking forward to really recover that money very fast. So because of that, they lack objectivity, because they're conflicted and they want to recover the money they've been using to campaign. Because you wonder, sometimes you look at the salaries that are paid to most of the politicians, it's not much, but you look at how much money is pumped into campaigns, into paying people there and there so that they can be able to vote. It's quite massive. So when they come in, they want to recover that money. So that's why they become so conflicted, then they lack objectivity. And of course, the other issue is also maybe lack of understanding in terms of how do we create cooperation. And I've said, like for instance, this country, if you do private partnerships, government does private partnerships and is able to say, like for instance, we have a lot of land, probably even in Kajiado, try to bring on investors, give them tax incentives so that they can be able to invest and then employ more people, and of course open up markets out of the country, then that is going to create jobs. Because one, jobs are informed, one, by the industries, and two, by markets. So one is open up markets, to create industries to serve these markets, and a very good, three, avail capital through like bank managing of bank interest, and government actually even trying to avail the land that some of the countries are doing, and in that way we are going to be able to create jobs. But if there's no commitment, if there's no objectivity, if there's no understanding, then you can't achieve creation of those jobs. It just becomes theory.
Right. Sitati, as you respond to that, remember during the campaigns, the Azimio One Kenya leader Raila Odinga did say that people are wearing clothes for dead people, that is the mtumba clothes. And Kenyans, of course, some Kenyans were up in arms, but he was just trying to get the point across that we need to have our local industries that produce clothes so that Kenyans can buy Kenyan products and, of course, bring the industries up. Kenyans would love to do that, but jeans from EPZ will cost about 1,000 shillings, and Tumba jeans probably go for, the same kind of jeans will go for 400 shillings. So then which way, how do we make it actually accessible and affordable for a Kenyan?
I mean, tracing or retracing the words of the former Prime Minister, Raila Odinga, during the campaign trail, I mean, I think he was right when he said that we need to stop importing this mitumba kind of stuff and focus or redirect our minds to see how we are going to establish vibrant textile industries in the country. The caveat to that is that if you want to produce locally and you need to have, textile products which are priced at an affordable rate, then that calls for mass production. Other countries have done it. Look at the example of China, for example. I mean, in the 80s, where were Chinese exporting their textile products? Virtually nowhere. But what happened? It's all about mass production, and then you have effective implementation of government policies. You look at other Asian countries, for example, the likes of Malaysia, Singapore, they have done the same or something similar. So I don't really understand why, if we are to go back to the history of Mitumba, what made Mitumba vibrant in this country? It's all these structural adjustment programs or policies which were being advanced by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in the late 80s and the 1990s. And unfortunately, they are still hanging around up to this particular time. So up and until we have a government that is willing to take the bold steps and ensure that we have the right industries in place, then we'll continue, making noises. We say, yeah, mitumba is cheaper, we can buy it. But at the end of the day, we are sacrificing, I think, the creation of jobs, because having vibrant textile industries in Kenya will not just create jobs for those engineers or plant operators in there. I mean, the multiply effect will be noticeable across the board. So that's really something which the incoming administration must be willing to take a bold step and facilitate the creation of, resuscitate the manufacturing sector in the country.
Right. And as we close, BWOSI, what is your idea of now the parameters that the government can put in place to cushion Kenyans at this time, because the economy is really dented at this point?
I believe that currently the economies are really at a bad state, and one is, before you remove incentives completely, there could be a status quo so that they could be able to observe what are some of the most immediate measures that you can do in order to remove incentives in the long run. And those short-term things, especially, of course, and I like what the president say, is that let's address the issue of fertilizer, but that's not enough. The thing is, where farmers not incentivized to produce, because if then you incentivize, like for instance, fertilizer, then they grow this maize, and then next year there is no market for that maize. That is what is actually demoralizing most of the farmers. So one is to first establish a market for the maize, establish the market for most of the things that we can be able to produce locally. If it is textile, do we have a market even in the neighboring countries that we can be able to export to them? So be able to capitalize on that, and then to now incentivize the farmers to plant because they have already a ready market. You saw, like, for instance, when the market for avocado opened in China, most farmers were able to take up that idea and invest in avocados. So really the best way to resuscitate the economy is to create a market, which market is always available if you look out for it, and be able to now incentivize the producers so that they can be able to do that. So the second thing they can do is, there is always a low-hanging fruit that is never exploited by most governments, and that is labor. Because Kenya, where we have so many people who are unemployed and who are youthful, and some of them have really capabilities that if you take them for some short courses, you are able to jumpstart their careers. Like, for instance, we had an agreement with the UK in terms of nurses. How many nurses can we train objectively and export them into some of those? Because currently the globe is experiencing labor deficits. If you look at everywhere in the world, there's a labor deficit. Can the president deliberately look at some of the Kenyans who are jobless, who have gone to school, actually invest in some of the retraining, and export them? Those people are going to actually bring in a lot of cash flows in form of foreign direct investment and start the capital. Then the other issue is to look at the manufacturing, retail, and businesses, corporates. Because yes, you're talking about hustlers, but it's the corporates who are able to employ these hustlers, establish, try to promote local companies by giving them opportunities in terms of capital, and capital means land and money to do that business. If you're able to avail those, maybe in terms of bank loans, because there's a risk now that bank loans are going to start going up the way they were, crazily at 20-23%. If we don't take precaution, those interest rates are going to reach there. If we are able to manage our bank interest rates, avail capital, and of course the idle land that is being used, make sure that it is used for production. If you can, the government can distribute that land through private partnerships, then that is going to spur the creation of industries, create employment, and absorb all this.
And so ensure that the levies and the taxes on fuel go down in the long run, so that we have at least affordable, prices of fuel going forward. But in the short term, I can't really see any measure apart from the government maintaining the fuel subsidy, and perhaps even for the maize subsidy, unfortunately, at this time. Right. Yeah.
And thank you so much, gentlemen, for being part of this conversation. Ronald BWOSI, in my immediate right, an economist, and SITATI WASILWA, who is a political economist. That is where we come to a close right here on Look Up News. I am Nancy NELIMA. Thank you so much for watching. We have been focusing on the surging fuel prices that Kenyans are complaining, and of course, fuel prices which have a direct effect to the rise of prices of other commodities. We appreciate you for watching. Let's talk again, and let's meet again at another time. Have yourselves a pleasant evening. Good night.